VR, AR, and XR accessibility. This day two panel of researchers, developers, industry, and consumers was focused on VR, AR, XR advances and accessibility. We heard some amazing possibilities on day one, which this day two panel explored, again, looking both at barriers these advances may pose and at opportunities they may provide. Speaker bios are at futureofinterface.org/bios. Shuri Azenkot was unable to join due to COVID.
I'm Christine Hemphill. It's my absolute pleasure to host the next session and facilitate an absolutely brilliant panel around the barriers and the challenges and the opportunities of immersive technologies as it relates to inclusion and of disability and challenges, barriers, and ways that we can actually use these technologies to really enhance capability, human to computer, human to human, and human individual. I'm going to just introduce each of the panel very briefly, and then as you introduce yourself, when I pass you, do you want to just share a little bit about, firstly, the barriers that you are concerned about in immersive technologies that we're aware of today, but also as we project forward, especially given that fascinating conversation yesterday, anything from enhanced visual technologies right through olfactory engagement for scent immersive technologies. So the four people we have today: Dylan Fox, a UX designer and accessibility consultant, but also the head of community at XR Access. Larry Goldberg, independent consultant, former Yahoo head of accessibility, also the founder of XR Access. The Professor Pilar Avero, lovely to see you again, from the Universitat de Barcelona and the Transmedia Lab there, and Dr. Yuhang Zhao from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dylan, if I can pass to you first, could you please share with me some of the things that you're both worried about and excited about in terms of accessibility of immersive going forward the next 20 years?
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Christine. There's so many to choose from, but I think some of the ones that are top of mind for me, first is that I think there's a line that we often draw between kind of mainstream accessibility, right? Of we want every application to be accessible to everyone as much as possible, and assistive technologies, right? Which is XR applied specifically aimed at people for disabilities to support them. And I think that line is kind of a little bit more wavery than we like to think. I think there's some really interesting capabilities in terms of taking, for example, AR devices that could maybe identify text for people who are blind or dyslexic, and taking things like that and just making that a part of mainstream VR AR devices, making that something that can be leveraged by humans and computers alike, just in everyday use. I think a lot about things like that, and I think about the ways that we can really leverage XR, the sensors that we already have in place on all these devices, to take information that oftentimes computers are just using, to make, for example, holograms more believable, to just map occlusion and things. And instead of just assuming, oh, the person can see that with their own eyes, why don't we hold off on that assumption and think, how can we make this information that we've gathered useful to people who maybe don't have the senses to see that type of thing? Yeah, there's so much more, but I'll pass it to the next person.
Thank you so much, Dylan. Larry, if I can go to you next, in terms of the things you're both worried about, looking at where some of the barriers that we're aware of exist today, but also some of the really exciting opportunities within the technologies looking forward.
Yeah, well, so much more fun to talk about opportunities. We're confronted with barriers all the time on everything we're doing. But I think we encounter the kind of barriers in the fields of all the VR, AR, XR, immersive that we hit today: object recognition, audio recognition, ability to control devices, When we started XR Access, that's somewhat where we began. Let's map what we're frustrated with today and try to make sure it doesn't happen in tomorrow's technology. But some of that can be a bit hampering. The kind of basics you start with today on a new app website. Oh, is it compatible with screen readers? Can JAWS read what's on the screen? Well, that can be very confining when we're looking at 10, 20 years down the road and trying to decide today it has to be compatible with today's AT. We don't really know what the platforms will be in the future, what the hardware will be, what the software will be. Today's headsets are massive barriers, financially, discomfort. You've got a cochlear implant. We all imagine, oh, that's all going to change. That will be completely different in the future. So projecting what barriers we're facing is really somewhat dependent on how we're going to build it out. We know principles. If somebody says something, you should be able to see it in text. Okay, that's a principle. Now let's build it. That's a whole different thing. So that compatibility with AT, and what is the AT of the future? Is there no AT? Because we've solved it all. Hopeful thinking. And I just want to emphasize something Dylan said. Not only do we want to make sure that what we're building and thinking about building is usable, but is it useful? I mean, really, do we have a need for what we're expecting to appear in the mainstream market? We'll talk a little bit more. I wanted to address the questions of AR versus VR, but we'll get to that in a bit. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Larry. And across to you, Pilar, your perspectives on, you've done a lot of work on barriers and also really helping adapt for individual, differences. What are your perspectives on the current challenges and where those challenges might vary looking forward for the next couple of decades?
Okay, first of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me. I'm very surprised. I'm very proud to be here. I didn't expect this at all, but anyway, and I want to say hello to Larry because it's been a long time. Barriers. I'm going to be amazingly pedestrian and very simple. My first barrier would be icons. We have no iconography. And this is something that we would need to signal the services, to signal the devices, to signal what we do. And this is something that to me is very, very basic, but again, is very important. But not only icons, also earcons, because people who cannot hear or cannot see, so we would have to set up sort of an iconography, but in all sorts of, that would be to me number one. And I think that is quite urgent to solve. The second one is something that I heard yesterday, is translation. That to me, because I live in Europe where there are so many languages, translation, it's a prerequisite. Any interaction, any interface should be in the language of the person who is. So otherwise it would lead to something called linguistic accessibility. So which all of us, I mean, if you put me in Tokyo, I can't read anything and I can't understand anything that anybody says to me, though I am neither blind nor deaf. So this linguistic accessibility, again, is a prerequisite. It's almost automatic. So to me, there is not that amazing thing to be done. It's just basically plug a Google Translator, plug whatever, and then you have it. So it's not that. Something that for the last, since 2017, we've been testing access services, that is captioning, audio description and sign language in immersive environments. And we have found out that people don't know how to switch on the devices, how to interact with devices. And that is, someone said that's obvious in the previous panel already. So that is, again, something that's, and the last thing is that it would be fantastic to have samples, as I think Vince said that earlier on today. We would have to have samples of what works and what doesn't work. So we don't have to repeat the same mistakes. I have so many that you won't believe it. So, because we've made so many mistakes in these 5 years testing with people with disabilities. So I think to have, as Finn said, to have a collection of mistakes and solutions would also be fantastic. And I just leave it here. Thank you.
Pilar, I think, let's come back to that after, but that shared learning so we don't all have to make the same mistakes, and how do we actually create that space, place, tools, capability to crystallize learnings that have happened, hugely important. Thank you. And Dr. Yuhang Zhao, if you'd like to share the things that you're both concerned about in terms of barriers currently and potentially into the future.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. And I completely agree what Dylan, Larry, and Pilar has mentioned. And I also want to add that we have to admit that XR technology, including AR, VR, and mixed reality, they're still in its infancy. So that there is no a standard or well-established even interaction techniques to tell us or guide us how to build the best experience, not only for people with disabilities, but everyone who may potentially use this technology. For example, if you think about the more conventional 2D user interface, right? If you use computer, we almost are settled with the mouse and also keyboard, and then you use, the cursor to click the different buttons and do the target acquisition tasks, so that we can relatively, there is a clearer clue for us to make things more accessible. And also, if you think about the smartphone, right? So there is a well-defined set of gestures that people can do in terms of how you interact with this device. But when we shift to the 3D space, virtual reality or mixed reality, and then there is no settled conclusion in terms of how people should interact with things. For example, if you want to do just the basic target acquisition in the 3D space, there are all kinds of ways you can do that. For example, you can teleport there, or you can walk there to pick up things, or there could be a laser extended from your controller to point things. Or if we go more crazy, you can extend your virtual arm to reach things. And then there are still all kinds of these fancy interaction techniques coming up in the research field in terms of how we should interact in mixed reality. Which I think it could be a barrier, because if we don't have, a clear clue in terms of what would be the best set of interactions, and then it would be even harder to think about how to make it accessible. But at the same time, I also think this open up a big opportunity, because we can, start thinking about accessibility at the beginning and shape this definition of what would be the best interaction in AR, VR, and all kinds of these technologies. Yeah, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Yuhang. I think that is just such an important point, that what is a little bit of a risk at the moment in terms of not having a set of affordances, an agreed set of patterns for interaction or for movement, for the way things appear, as Pilar, you were saying, with icons or earcons and so on, is also such an opportunity to do better from earlier in this suite of technologies. We've looked at some of the barriers, as Larry, as you said, it's so much more fun looking at the opportunities. If we think about the ways that immersive technologies could address barriers that exist in society today, particularly for people with disabilities, whether they're human-computer interaction barriers today, human-to-human barriers, or human-to-space even barriers today, how could immersive potentially add function, capability, or efficiency, or even just pleasure and joy to people with disabilities in ways that without this technology people might not have? Larry, as you were excited by opportunities, I might go to you first this time.
Thanks. I think the magical word Yuhang just said was interactions. And my thought is that though we really shouldn't be choosing winners in this field of technology, we just have no idea. The notion that we could focus on enhancements of our reality, augmenting reality, that don't isolate us from each other, but actually enhance our ability, the human-to-human connection, is so much more interesting, exciting, I think flexible, so that if we find ourselves with a barrier in the real world, can we use this technology to overcome those barriers rather than crawling into an isolated space that virtual reality represents with or without a burdensome hardware, with the notion that we're relying on outside entities, major corporations to build in these solutions. Whereas with an augmented reality kind of mindset, we could add plugins, lightweight, low power kind of augmentations that could make the world as it is more accessible. I think of one of the examples often used in VR is, well, if you have a mobility impairment, you can travel anywhere in the world, it'll be fully accessible. And to me, that's almost an excuse not to make the real world more accessible. So, you know, you want to go visit this beautiful beach in Hawaii, but there's a long flight of stairs down to the beach. Oh, put on your headset, you can enjoy it anyway. Well, actually, why don't we build something down at the beach so we can actually enjoy it? And maybe when you get down to the beach, you can put on your headset and communicate with people, identify the fish in the sea, augment and enhance the real world, as opposed to take you out of this world and work so hard to make that false reality accessible. So I look towards that as not really picking a winner, but maybe the most optimistic progress we could make.
I think that's augmenting and adding to reality, not an alternate reality that you're stepping into, is just such an important one. It's not an excuse for not making things accessible. Is the other point I really like there. The one thing you're also talking about, and it's that the social engagement. So rather than going off into a space that's this isolated space that actually a lot of particularly VR sits in today, one thing we're certainly seeing is that trend towards social engagement in immersive spaces. So, being able to have that social engagement as part of the experience rather than stepping out of that for the experience, I think is a really, really important point there. Dylan, across to you next. What are you excited by that immersive technologies could support in human capability and overcoming barriers today?
Absolutely. Well, I think two of the simply the biggest thing for me on this is the idea of digitization, right? Because once you have digitized information, whether that's in AR, real world information, like again, text or the objects around you, or the people, or in a virtual environment where you're in, say, social VR, and there's other people doing things in your space. When you have that information available in a digital format, you can then convert it to other formats that make it accessible for people. And this is kind of unprecedented because, we've had for a while now apps like screen readers that make purely digital information accessible, right? If you have a website, hopefully it's meeting WCAG standards and whatnot, you can take that kind of purely digital information and make it accessible, whether people are blind or deaf or both, and it's just being converted to like Braille text. It's really transmutable. It's really modular. And AR and VR are allowing us to do the same thing with a tremendously greater variety of experiences. So if you have your AR glasses on, maybe you're deaf and it can digitize sound. It can display captions for you that people are talking. If you're blind, maybe it can digitize the text or the cars moving by you, so you know when it's safe to cross the road. And this applies as well in virtual reality. We're working right now on a NSF accelerator program that we're aiming to try to take all of the nonverbal things that people do in social VR and make those accessible to people that are blind. So when somebody waves at you or is looking at you, or where people are in the space that might be very difficult to know if you don't have access to that kind of modular information. So I'm really excited to see our understanding of the ways to design those experiences, both the ways to gather information and the ways to queue it to people that need it. I'm really excited to see those grow over time.
I love that, and I think that talking about the digital, we've got adaptive ways of sharing digital information today, but there's potentially more adaptive ways of sharing physical environment information in the future. And I think if you think about where a lot of barriers exist today, that's a really exciting opportunity area. Thank you so much. Pilar, across to you. What excites you about the places and ways that immersive could solve for barriers that exist today?
I have to complain because it's not fair that I'm the third one. I have to say something original now. Okay, I'll say something original, which is sound. Sound in immersive environment is amazing. And I think sound has got so many qualities, but also if we do treat sound as an object, then we can do so many things with it. So sound to me is something that is going to change everything. And it is really going to be very characteristic of immersive environments. Something that we have done that is very nice is with cognitive people with cognitive disabilities in 360 videos that they did themselves. It helped them enormously to know where they were, to place them in a place. So while they could look around, they were much more aware. I don't know if it's the verb, but much more focused. Or for example, we took them shopping to the supermarket and we told them, this is the supermarket where you're going to go every day, you have to go here and there. And because they could go around and they could see that the cleaning products were behind them and something more sort of a very concrete reality that then when they went to the supermarket, yes, it was that they had seen. So this level of concreteness, at this level of reality, that you can go around and really see what then you go around. You're not watching a television. It's almost like fiction television. This was a reality that helped people with cognitive disabilities enormously. And it worked. It worked. So to me, that is this sort of real presentiality, perhaps is called. It was fantastic. And they were very engaged and they were very happy as well. And it's lovely to see people that they're really happy because they can, they can work in the supermarkets because they had been in the supermarkets with the head-mounted devices practicing. So it was fantastic. It worked.
Pilar, I think there's a number of things there that are just so lovely. One, sound. I think the current digital 2D formats really prioritize sight. And they're quite visual domains, and particularly once you get to binaural sound, and we've got sound that is directional sound, there is so much richness of information that can be conveyed through sound in powerful and immersive ways, even without the headset. So Larry, you were talking before about at the moment there's this big barrier of headsets where actually 360-degree immersive sound can happen even without that. And it's such a powerful sense. So thank you for bringing up that. The other one is that what you were talking about in terms of the training of people with cognitive differences, we've seen this as well in terms of layering levels of friction so that people can choose the level of challenge or of friction they wish. And this is something that's obviously come out of the gaming community, but is so good in people learning, or people, whether it's a pilot learning how to fly a plane, that you can layer one level at a time, or people, who are neurodivergent learning how to take a train and layering one level of kind of overwhelming experience at a time to get used to it. And I think there is so much power in our ability, as you were saying, Dylan, that digitization of a physical world to then choose what level is suitable for any individual where they're at for what their job is that they're wanting to do. Thank you so much. Yuhang, across to you, and apologies, Pilar was third, but you get to go last. In terms of the opportunities, there are so many though. What excites you about the opportunities for immersive?
Yeah, so actually, I think both augmented and virtual reality excited me in different ways because I think they both have potentials, but they are designed in different ways and could be used to support different functionalities or serve for different aims. So in terms of augmented reality, so Pilar has mentioned audio, and I actually also appreciate, the visual feedback, the very immersive visual feedback that can be anchored and registered in the real world, even though it could bring more accessibility issues, but at the same time, it can also be used to enhance people's abilities in different ways. So for example, some of my research focuses on people with low vision who do have visual impairments, but they still have functional vision to use, which means that augmented reality glasses could be a very powerful tools that we can recognize the surrounding environment and further generate visual augmentations. Of course, we can combine all kinds of the other multi-module feedback, but visual augmentations is a very important channel for them to further process and interpret the surrounding environment. So that's, I see how augmented reality could further help and enable people with disabilities and further enhance their abilities in their daily life. And also, augmented reality also open up this big opportunity that you can incorporate all kinds of sensors to understand not only the surrounding environment, but also the user themselves. For example, eye tracking, which we potentially can use that together with people with low vision and understand their gaze, their intent, so that we can generate more targeted augmentations. But also, by using these sensors, there will be a lot more issues in terms of privacy that comes up that we've discussed a lot in the prior panels as well. But I'd be happy to talk more about them later in this panel. And in terms of virtual reality, I do agree it has the risk of isolating people, but I also think it has its own potential in terms of connecting people and build up remote collaboration and communication that people may not be able to do. It's beyond experiencing, let's say, travel to different places that people can never do, because it's also a matter of cost and time. For example, if this card panel is not virtual, right? We have to travel to one place together, and a lot of people, even myself, may not be able to make it. But now it's virtual, then what about we can design a fully immersive virtual experience that can, further, make people closer to each other and better communicate with each other. But of course, which it makes it more important to make such an emerging technology more accessible.
I think it's again a really good point. Not everyone wants to go to the physical, but actually this does support people. Someone in my team who's a wheelchair user who would love to skydive, but that's probably not going to be the next thing. But this is a way to do that, and actually that social element of people in different places and lower cost. Larry, across to you.
Yeah, I just want to make a point that even though I might downgrade the notion of virtual reality where our focus should be, I think we really need to distinguish between remote, which we're doing today, and virtual. Like every one of us who's talking right now could be an avatar. Why? We were forced to use these remote technologies a few years ago. There were some accessibility problems early on, relatively solved now in a period of 2-3 years. That was pretty great. But I think the question that, for instance, the XR Access annual symposium, how great is it that people were able to come to it from 40 countries, hundreds and hundreds of people from all over the world? The word was virtual, but it was remote. It was hybrid. Maybe this year they'll actually be able to be in person and remote. But I don't think that's necessarily the virtuality that we kind of lean into when you talk about turning everyone into an avatar.
It's an interesting point, and I think that remote versus virtual, whether it's remote tourism versus virtual tourism, and social engagement, and actually hybrid is a very interesting point. And if we were thinking about some of the really interesting discussions yesterday about having full life-size, holograms of people And you've got some people in space physically and some people in space virtually, how we might allow that here and there experience to merge a little bit more fairly. You know, at the moment, I think there's a here experience and there's a there experience, and they're not quite equivalent. So how we can provide greater equivalence of that. In terms of, you know, we've got the, you know, here's some challenges, here's some of the ways in which this technology could address today's challenges. What will be the difference between them? And I know, actually, I might just go back to you, Larry, first, because you've mentioned it a couple of times, but that augmented reality versus VR, do we prioritize effort? How do we actually make the difference between this very positive power of these technologies as they come through and potential barriers? What do we need to be doing now in order to move to a more utopian capability rather than dystopian?
Yeah, we're looking for utopia here for sure. And I heard loud and clear yesterday when Utah had spoken that we shouldn't pick and choose what we're going to make accessible. We should make sure we do as much as possible. Recently, in an interview I was doing with a book that may yet come out sometime this decade, a representative of a major corporation said, very dedicated to accessibility. He said, if there's no product, there's no product accessibility. And his point was, how early should we start? Should our MVP and beta versions be fully accessible when the product may never go anywhere? So that's kind of why I lead into the notion we can get much more up to speed faster by enhancing our realities. Also, I could keep falling back on this. If you were using virtual reality technology and you work very hard on making it fully accessible to everyone, it still might not be anything you're using for more than an hour or two a day. What's going to be embedded in our lives on a regular basis? Would you be willing, like right now I'm wearing my AirPod Pros. The notion, from what we hear, Apple's going to come out with something that is lightweight, not obtrusive, not creating stigmas. So can we focus on those kind of enhancements that I think the sky's the limit in terms of enhancing the experience of people with disabilities, cognitive, physical, sensory. And I think we've already gone down that road quite a bit. I think we've already done some pretty interesting things. We haven't grappled yet with haptics, which are amazing. I think we can do some great things. Turning sound into other things beyond text. I'm a great music fan. I think about the book that Oliver Sacks wrote about music, Musicophilia, and the kind of things you could do turning music into completely other experiences. Now, do you want to? Do you want to turn your music into a light show? I think we can do that readily. I think those are things we could experiment in and figure out, is this a use case worth delving into and putting resources into? Would users really want it? Because we could do it pretty rapidly.
I think that just touches on a point that I might pass to you actually, Dylan, next, which is where there are so many things that can be done, which ones should be done and which ones must be done urgently and which ones would enhance an experience later, but there's an order here of effort. And then I'm also going to, Pilar, just as a warning, you know, and Yuhang, you know, universities training, how do we actually share this out further so that everyone's doing it? But Dylan, for you first, that order of priority of what's the most urgent barriers to address or opportunities to open?
So I think that one of the big things that we're trying to address, and we have a program at XR Access that's about to come out to try to look at this more, is the lack of accessible open source code. Because we've come a long way in the last few years of figuring out from a design perspective of how to design for accessible XR. And you know, you can read any number of design guidelines from Meta or from the XR Association or from W3C, but there's a real dearth of examples of just sample code that people can look up and pull from and tinker with. That's something that we're going to be addressing very soon. We have a program calling Prototype for the People, where we're going to try to get groups like hackathon folks, boot camps, student classes, trying to get people to contribute to a more rich open source accessible code bases that we can even stop forcing people to reinvent the wheel when it comes to accessibility, lower the cost of making something accessible from I need to like research and develop this from scratch to I just need to use this plugin somebody wrote, right? That for me is number one. I think number two is there's one kind of big barrier that I don't think we really fully understand how to cross yet, which is the XR accessibility object model. Basically, how do you use screen readers in XR? Right now, we have a few people that are kind of prototyping on this. I know Alchemy Labs has done some interesting thinking around like, if I point at something, it tells me what it is. And that's fantastic. That's a good like first step. But if you're looking at an HTML web page, it has a structure, right? It has headers, H1, H2, H3, it has links, it has landmarks, such that if you're using a screen reader, if you're dealing with it purely in this kind of text and audio format, you can navigate effectively. You don't have to just like listen through one thing at a time through every piece of content on the web page. You can say, okay, show me the headers. Oh, I'm interested in that one. Dive into that one. Oh, okay, I see. And get a very quick feel for like what is in this website, what is in the space. And we do not have anything like that for XR right now. It's really, there's a lot of things that are helping for people that are low vision, but for people that are fully blind, it's still an incredibly inaccessible format. And so that is trying to understand how we create this accessibility object model of how do we define the space? How do we like subdivide this space? How do we let somebody who's using it, a screen reader, access parts of that, which instantly will also open up to incredibly large numbers of just computer accessibility functions. Once the computers understand, oh, this is what's in this space, this is how I can subdivide this space, here are the landmarks for the space, it's really going to open up a lot of opportunities for able-bodied people as well. I'd really like to see more research into that area. And that's something that we've started with the XR Association. And if anybody knows of ongoing research into that, please get in touch. Thus at XR Access here.
Dylan, thank you. I think that's, making it easier, making it lower cost for people to get it right by default is going to be such a critical way of doing, as you were saying, Larry, what Josh was suggesting, this has to go everywhere, and it can only go everywhere if the cost is low enough that it's easy for people to do. And I think the object model, knowing how to describe a space, is a key part of that. And what would be interesting is how much of that is just pervasive across any type of space, and how much of that would be journey specific, that you're there doing an educational thing and it's got these, certain types of content or certain types of engagement in it that would be specific, and how much of it is individual. So how much of it, might be depending on the way in which you either wish to interact and or the way your mental model works to find things in space. So that would be, a really interesting match. Pilar, across. Sorry, Dylan.
I just wanted to add really quick, for people that are interested in lowering that barrier, we've gathered as many resources as we can find on the XR Access resources GitHub. And I'll post a link to that in Discord and chat, but I encourage folks to check that out if they're looking for kind of low, ways to make their thing easier and more accessible.
Thank you. And that collaboration too is a key part of that, having spaces such as GitHub to do so. Pilar, across to you in terms of, lowering that barrier and prioritization of where we should start, what are the urgent ones, what are the important ones, and where can we go? Where would you start?
Okay. I have yesterday and today, it is very clear that everybody's focusing on the human and how can the human be, how can you compensate? How can you, this is very good, but to me, there is another big issue, big chunk there, which is what the humans are consuming. What is the content, the media content that they are consuming, and what are the requirements that this multimodality, the video and the audio, is they're posing to the human? Because the human, it's a different human if you watch a Woody Allen movie, as if you watch an ice hockey, as if you, so the complexity of and the how fast, for example, images happen, how fast is the dialogue happening. It doesn't matter who the human is. It is dependent in a way of what they are consuming. So to me, that is very interesting, and it is something where I am definitely going to do research now, because we believe, or at least we think, that if we could understand, and that is already done, so there's nothing new in it, the complexity of video, for example, or the complexity of audio. The complexity of audio could be, for example, if we do a sentiment analysis, and then that can annotate automatically what we are listening to. The complexity of the video can then tell us if we can somehow understand what is the cognitive load that is required to see that. Then, for example, we can offer different types of captions, very simple captions, then very elaborated captions, and put them there on display. And then the human would choose what type of captions, sort of a summarized captions, or a very, very summarized caption, or the opposite, amazingly, yeah. And to me, then the focus is not on the human, but on the environment or the content. This, how can I explain that? The content offering different, all automatically, of course, what is, to me, that is the challenge. Automatically, the content in itself, making itself accessible in different degrees. So the personalization would be done by the human, but in the sense of dependent on the content that they are consuming. And again, in a multimodal way. So it would be video, and it would be audio, and it would be in the space, and it would be with directionality. So you would have all these elements that XR offers you. To me, this is interesting because I don't see very much being done on that. Also, I think that it is achievable in the sense that there is already plenty of software that tells you the complexity of videos, the complexity of movements, for example. We already have alternative text being done automatically. So that allows me, with very low resources, to try to understand or try to put together and to try to start testing this idea of, I don't know how to call it really, sort of the accessible content or the responsive content or something like that, where the objective, my object of study is not the human. My object of study is the content, which is a bit different from everybody else, but that's what I'm doing.
I think that's a really interesting point, and that responsiveness of the content to the human that's where a lot of failure happens. So if you have too much optionality in it, it can be very hard to find what might be suited to the person. So how much do you use? We've talked about sensors, we've talked, how does, we've been doing testing with people with different cognitive differences, and they've got the left-right controllers the wrong way around. Now, the computer can know that. They can see that from every time something's coming at them on one side, they're going the wrong side, and could do, we think there might be this challenge here. Maybe you'd like to swap them over. Not taking control away from the individual, but recognizing that something might be different and almost lifting out of a menu item 3 layers down what might be relevant to this particular user in this particular piece of content to make it easier for them. Actually, my colleague and I were talking about floors that could potentially raise to pick things up. We were hearing about how you can pick things up in different ways in immersive before, but maybe, you know, if it's very difficult for you to reach down for something, the floor might come up to you. We don't have to be limited by physics here. So if the content knows that you don't have limited reach, it can change the content to make it a suitable level of friction for the individual. Yu-Hung, I see you have your hand up. Across to you, and then after you, I might have, I've got a lovely question here from Elle, and then I'll come to you, Larry.
Yes, sorry, I was raising my hand because I want to follow up on Dylan's point, which is also closely related to how what I think would be the most urgent barriers that we want to address. So I'll just answer all of these all together. So I think the biggest barrier to me is the gap between the accessibility community and AR/VR community, or even the general technical community. So what does it mean is we actually have run a study, because there has been all kinds of accessible techniques, even for mixed reality AR/VR, that researchers have done. Myself also has done all kinds of these, sparse interaction techniques that assist people with disabilities for all kinds of tasks in mixed reality. But the issue is, where does all of these go, right? They wouldn't just stay in academia as a paper or just a prototype that we demonstrate people at a conference. And how we can convince people that they should really use this technology and bring them to the mainstream platforms that every other people are also using, and how we can lower the barriers to enable people to do that. So one of the project that we've been working on is we talk to actually XR developers in different types of companies and organizations to understand their interpretation of XR accessibility. How do they think they should incorporate or implement accessibility in their XR project, and what would be the barriers? And turn out it's very difficult for them to even understand what are the barriers that people with disability face in the virtual space or when they're using XR technologies, right? And then even currently we are gathering, for example, XR Access are trying to putting together these different XR accessibility guidelines and put some open source out there. But when the developers looking at these guidelines, they still don't have a clue in terms of how they can implement all the technical details. What would be, the severity or priority of a specific guideline? There is no demo videos, and again, similar to Dylan's point, there is no open source codes, and even they're out there, they may not be able to understand what would be the best way to use it and how much time and effort they would spend by leveraging these examples. So there are all kinds of these complex issues that can potentially prevent the other technical people to actually incorporate accessibility in their applications. Because in the future, we are not going to only have the accessibility researchers making accessible things. We are going to encourage and educate every other people to have this notion of accessibility and also have the ability to implement accessibility in their projects.
I absolutely love that, Yu-Hung, and I think that accessibility community and design development community, the gaps there are very costly. I would add another one, that the disability community themselves to the accessibility community, there can sometimes be a gap, and so just closing that user, designer, developer, client, outcome generator, closing the gaps between there and essentially redefining how design, how we practice design, so that the user informs that design right from the start, and particularly diverse users are informing that design right from the start, rather than needing these kind of quite clunky steps between different sets of knowledge that all need to come together to generate the outcome. Thank you so much. Larry, across to you, and then I'll go to Elle's question there.
Well, part of what I wanted to mention was Elle's question, and if we're talking about eventually creating a research agenda for the future, this idea of what can these technologies do for people neurodivergent, I don't think we really have much of a grip on that yet. I think it's a really rich area that we might really be able to do some pretty amazing things with these technologies, but it's kind of wide open in terms of how, what would we do to really dig into these advancing technologies. A much more mundane one, but very important, that Pilar brought up, and that's about content. One of the biggest issues in terms of failed accessibility on the web and apps is missing alt text, images. There have been little baby steps on using image recognition technology, but never in context, never dynamic images. Audio description is something I've worked on for years. Machines are so far away from being able to do description of a dynamic visual image. Well, that's what we're talking about in VR. I think a pretty advanced research agenda would include, how could we advance machine learning and AI to fill this giant missing gap of accessible images throughout all our digital tools?
I think that's, that the gaps that exist there today, are enormous. There is so much opportunity within there, particularly, people with learning disabilities. We've seen immersive used really powerfully within that space. Actually, from really functional learning and ability to go and do things like catch trains that they might not have been able to do before, to hedonistic fun. We had someone in our community that wanted to go to concerts but doesn't have the ability because there's some social challenges, and on the autism spectrum just found going to a physical concert wasn't possible. To be able to step into that and step out of that in a digital format that is more immersive than the current digital formats was something that was really going to be looked forward to. And I think there's so much opportunity for that layering, and being able to reduce friction that today in the physical world and build in as you wish and need. I have a few other questions here. Let me go to that. I have another one here from Elle, which is, thank you, Elle. What impacts do you see VR having for neurodivergent individuals? Oh, sorry, that one we've had. Do developers and designers make accessible applications effectively? Thank you, Joel, from you. Over to you, particularly, Dylan, you were talking about that. Do you want to pick up on that first?
So to understand, the question is basically just, how can designers and developers make more accessible applications? Or, yeah, I think there's a number of things that go into this, right? I mean, accessibility can be a field in and of itself, but there's also a ton of things that I think anybody who considers himself a good designer or a good developer should know, right? One of the things that got me into accessibility in the first place was this idea that I was in UX design, and in UX design, we hold up like user needs as the Bible, as the guiding light. You look at what users need, and then you solve for that problem. And yet, people tend to just ignore the needs of huge swaths of people with disabilities, right? If I need to be able to hear things instead of see them, and you're just completely ignoring that, can you really call yourself a good designer? And so I think what we need to do is, first of all, just get anywhere we teach people design and development, we need to teach them about accessibility. Shout out to Teach Access, who's been doing some absolutely amazing work on that. I think we then need to make it easier to make things accessible, right? As I said, making good design documentation, making good open source accessible code, getting to big platforms, so Unity, Meta, other folks to build in accessibility as much as possible, so that individual creators don't have to reinvent the wheel from scratch. Thinking about just doing a little bit of accessibility testing when you're doing Q&A, right? Like, can you play the game one-handed? Can you play the game muted? Can you play the game blindfolded? Ideally, can you play the game on a really tiny screen? Like, all of these types of things are things that anybody can do, that will just get you thinking a little bit more about making your game more robust for people with disabilities. And I guarantee when you do that, you're gonna make it better for all of your users.
Dylan, absolutely. There is stuff that people can do for themselves. There's also people that they can engage with, and people do usability testing today. And if there's one thing, one little hack that I think people could do, if they change usability testing from people who have no additional needs to people that have really specific access needs and potentially disabilities, but also other specific characteristics of difference, you get so much more for your numbers of people you're bringing in. It's a really efficient way of just making better product. So back to that teach access, just changing the way that we're making things today. There's a great question here in terms of communication. We've talked about cognitive needs, but communication, and for people that communicate differently or don't communicate vocally, how do we engage the technology? And they might be using an assistive technology like an AAC separately. And how does that computer to computer engagement or alternative communication, or even just communication, say with a different accent, like a deaf accent, work within a VR space? And we heard yesterday about Project Euphonia, and I know there's a lot of work happening in voice UI, but how could that infuse the immersive space to make it more accessible to people with communication differences? Who would like to take that one on?
I can take that one on. For example, one of the things that we've realized of people consuming captions in XR is that the biggest problem is not to read the captions, but you would think that was the problem. No, the biggest time lapse is not in reading, but in locating who is speaking. And that is something very interesting. We have to learn that different viewing patterns that we have in XR that we don't have in 2D, that is something that we've learned as well. And also how we have to personalize viewing, not, again, I'm going back to that, not because of who is the human, but what is the human getting. So guiding mechanisms to guide people to the environment where they are, that, for example, would be important for everyone. That sort of thing. I think it's where we need to go to, I think.
Thank you, Pilar. Does anyone else have a thought in terms of alternate communication? Yuhang, across to you.
Yeah, so I actually want to use the deaf community as an example when they communicate with each other via ASL, because in virtual reality, we actually find that they have their own community to communicate with each other. And of course, this heavily relies on the advance of the hardware technology as well. For example, there are usually when you communicate via ASL, you are not only doing hand gestures, right? Your facial expressions and body gestures are also very important, and even hand gestures, right? Those finger gestures, they cannot completely conveyed via the current virtual space, just through the devices, the controllers. So what people have done is they actually have this adapted version called VR ASL that they sort of simplify the current ASL that they are using in the real world, so that they use some simpler gestures to replace the more fine-grained gestures that they would use in the real world. But I think just going ahead along this road, it is very important to enhance both the hardware and also the software. For example, potentially back to Larry's point before, that we can incorporate AI technology together with XR so that we can better support people. Even I'm doing a relatively simpler gesture because of the limitation of the hardware, but can we better interpret and predict the people's intention and virtually show the exactly right ASL to the other people.
Thank you. And Yuhang, I think the deaf community is a community that could be so well served within this space. And I know there's been some great work done at Guadalajara University. We're working with someone at Story Futures who are looking at how you can add sign language content. And I think that capturing, both capturing really good quality sign language and not obviously just hands, but face and, facial emotional recognition could equally be very useful to the autistic community. But the extent of hands, and that quality of capture and gesture capture would be so useful for so many other areas, but equally the quality of the rendering so that it's really understandable sign language on return as well. So, you know, it's one of those things, one, it could serve a community that's highly underserved, but also it would increase the quality of both capture and rendering of information that is visual information within. Thank you. Larry, across to you.
I think the ultimate communication solution will have to wait for Andreas and his brain-computer interface folks to not only help generate and receive, but to connect our minds with each other. Okay, so maybe 50 years for that. In the meantime, there's some great research that could be done. For instance, and I see Christian Vogler's name on screen, and he's very deeply interested and concerned about sign recognition and sign generation. And I don't think we're there yet on either. But it really actually fits very well with image recognition, except the images are sign language and they're very nuanced. I think we're not too close yet on good sign recognition. And even the signing avatars are only okay. But I think there's so much more we could see within a decade on recognition of sign, using that to communicate, and recognition of any other dynamic images as well.
This has been an absolute pleasure. We're at time. Time has absolutely flown. I just want to thank you all for your contributions. Thank you everyone who was sharing the questions and really generating such a fabulous discussion. Greg, back to you.